out there by any collar manufacturer for adult bucks that would incorporate neck swell during the rut. So we kind of came up with our own, and the brain trust behind this design was the director Wasley himself. I did assist in the construction of it, but they actually worked out pretty well. This collar was on a deer for almost 2 years on a buck, and it's kind of hard to tell from the picture, but that's just nylon webbing with a little round bungee in the centerpiece. And so, over time they rub on trees and fight with each other, and they'll eventually wear off and fall off. But we get to collect the data. We get all the data. It's transmitted through the satellites anyway, but it's also stored in that box right there. So this is just kind of a brief overview on the 3 study areas for the migration I'm just going to talk about today. The top panel is summer ranges, typical summer ranges, and the bottom panel is typical winter ranges. On the left-hand side, we have the Carson Range, so it's high elevation summer range, fairly productive, but it's also largely tree covered. We got alpine, a mix of alpine and ponderosa pine. That's Marlette and obviously Lake Tahoe in the background. Simpson Park Range in central Nevada is much lower elevation, and this photo actually isn't completely representative. A lot of Simpson Park's burned in 1999, so there's not that much PJ, but there is pockets that are unburned. But fairly productive meadows. And on the right-hand side, we have the Ruby Mountains, which are probably some of the most productive deer summer range we have in the States. High elevation, it gets a lot of snow even in fairly droughty years. A lot of shrub cover, a lot of good forbs and grasses for fawn production. The winter range, we have pretty stark contrasts. On the left-hand side, we have Carson City right there. You're looking at basically Ash Canyon to Kings Canyon until you can see some encroachment on the typical winter range. Poses obvious challenges for deer. This is taken out of the fixed-wing contract pilot we have. Then the central Nevada, typical sage shrubland upland there, fairly productive winter range. Open country, great mule deer winter range habitat. And then on the right, Ruby Mountains, some significant PJ cover, we're working on that, but also very productive open sage. So this is just kind of a graphic showing the distribution of collars and the rubies. The green dots are summer range GPS locations, and the blue dots are winter range. And the take-home message here is just to look at that distribution of different pockets of winter range. So these deer, for the most part, summer and the central part of the rubies there. But the real variation on the behavior and the migration is along the winter range. So you can see that gradient. Animals that go at the very bottom of the map there is near Antelope Summit. So just to orient you, these are the Diamond Mountains off to the left there, and then the central part of the rubies, and then the south end of the rubies near Buck Mountain and on towards Antelope Summit by Highway 50. So as I mentioned before, we've caught 780 mule deer, primarily using, all using a helicopter and net gun that we contract out. We collect as much data from them as we can. We have them in hand. We collect a weight, a body condition, body size, metrics, and also blood samples, attach the collar. So in the picture below there, we're measuring the lower jaw. We use that as a morphometric measurement. That's myself and Dr. Stewart with the ultrasound machine, preg testing that doe on the table there. But we also use the ultrasound machine on their back so we can measure the depth of the fat on their rump, and that's what we use as an index of body condition. There's just a close-up view of the ultrasound machine, the same one that's used in cattle operations, equine operations. It's hard to tell in this picture, and I don't have a pointer on here that I can use, but you can kind of make out, if you squint your eyes, a backbone of a fetus there, and those round things are the cotyledons that provide nutrients to the growing fetus. Just some more pictures of our capturing. This is the right-hand side. There's the crew coming in. That's Jacks Valley, it's just south Carson City. Some of the UNR grad students, been a really good opportunity to get help and volunteers from UNR to help out with our captures. This picture, just kind of a glance at what the weight data looks like. So the red is females, and the blue is males. On the top panel, fawns, and on the bottom panel, adults. Obviously, you'd expect a size difference on adult deer. There's an obvious separation there. On average, about 125 pounds for does. About 168, I think, is that mean for bucks. Fawns, a lot more variation. Overall, males are bigger. However, we do see a lot more variation. These are box plots, so the black line is the median, and the ends are the 90 and 10 percentiles. Here's one of our biologists, Jeremy Lutz, with a deer, collaring a deer on the Simpson Park Range. Caleb McAdoo, Area 10. This is during the first year, I believe, when we put VHF collars on bucks. We also put an ear tag in all the deer that we catch, and that helps us to identify them, obviously, out in the field, but we put our phone number on there. We've had many of them returned by sportsmen, both harvested, legally harvested. Also, they may find them dead in the field before we do. We've even had some just random ear tags turned in that were found out in the field. And it does help us a lot of times solve a little picture of a puzzle if we lost track of a deer or something like that. There's one of our UNR technicians. This is Ben Regan, standing above Marlette Lake. Monitoring 780 collars across the state is a huge endeavor, and it takes a lot of field time. So I was fortunate enough to get some grant money from UNR to hire these technicians. We use them to both find the collars when there's a mortality event or just to pick them up when they fall off, and also do some behavioral observations. So there's some of that variation in migration strategy that I was alluding to. So on the left, this is just a kind of a clear-cut example here. On the left-hand side, we have what we would consider a resident strategy, so that the color in red and yellow there is just a home range. And the hotter the color, the more central it is to their home range. You can see that deer throughout 2 years of monitoring never really went more than about 4 miles max distance across its home range. On the right-hand side, we see a much different strategy. This is what we consider a long-distance migrator. The scales are exactly the same. This is the same orientation as I showed you before. This is the southern end of the rubies, and then that mountain range on the left-hand side there that's not colored is the diamonds. So we've got Newark Lake Valley and Huntington Valley. But it's interesting to note that these animals were caught on the exact same spot on Winter Range near Harrison Pass. But on the one hand, we have a complete resident. On the other hand, on the right, we have a long-distance migrator. That's 75 miles as the crow flies, but we've actually seen much longer movements than that. And obviously, the true path along that way is much greater than 75 miles. So this is a different way of showing that kind of variation. We have on the left-hand side, we have the Ruby Mountains. On the right-hand side, we have the Carson Tahoe. The gray bars are residents, and the black bars are migrants. On the x-axis, we just have the location date. On the y-axis, we have the distance from where it was caught. So if you think about it, if an animal never moved very far from where it was caught, the distance doesn't change much. So we define that as a resident. If it moves fairly substantially as time goes on and goes to summer range, then we see where that increase in the y-axis, that means it's moving. If you compare the Carson to the rubies, you can see right off the bat that there's less synchrony in the Ruby Mountains. That it's spread out over a farther time scale. And also of note is just to notice the scale on the y-axis. So 80 kilometers on the rubies versus 35. So the deer in the Ruby Mountains migrate much farther than the Carson Range. So when we looked at just quantifying the number of residents versus migrants, that was one of our basic questions. Right off the bat, we see stark differences between the Ruby Mountain deer and the Simpson Park deer. 65% migrants, but if you include partial migrants, which I have not defined here, but it gets tricky. There's some statistical models that you can use, but basically if an animal moved 2.5 times greater than its home range, we considered that a migrant, and it returned. If it did that one time, we considered that a partial migrant. If it never moved greater than 2.5 times its home range, it was a resident. And then we also have this other classification called dispersal. That was typically for fawns. So we did see one-time movements where deer would move to an entirely different mountain range. We had deer in the Ruby Mountains that dispersed to the Diamonds. We had deer in the Simpson Parks that dispersed to the North Toyabes, to Roberts Mountain, to the Cortez Range. So right off the bat, you see big differences. Simpson Parks, primarily resident deer. Ruby's, primarily migrant deer. Makes sense ecologically. If you know the climate out there, the Simpson Parks is, generally gets much less snow, less harsh conditions. Carson Range is more similar to the Rubies, and that kind of makes sense ecologically too. It's a snowpack regime similar to the Rubies. We did see a much greater instance of residents in the Carson Range. These are associated with they're urban areas. Essentially, we do have deer actually living right inside the city limits of Carson City. Also, the areas of Lakeview and places like that, Jacks Valley, close proximity to residential areas. Of interesting note is that on that dispersal, on that top right-hand panel, we did see greater dispersal of juveniles in the Simpson Parks. And I do think this has implications for density. Some research showing that higher density, higher populations, higher density is more likely to have dispersal, especially in juvenile bucks. So we may have something going on there density-wise. Some of the survival analyses, we used a modeling procedure. I'm not going to get into the weeds of it, but we use these individual parameters to test our overall survival hypotheses. We use sex. That one's obvious. Age, in this case, we're just looking at adults versus juvenile. Migration distance. We quantified this by net displacement, and I have a figure later that kind of shows this a little better. Our body condition index, I'll get into that in the next slide, but it's really similar to the body mass index that we use for humans. Winter severity, it's just a combination of snow severity and temperature severity. It's published in Wildlife Monograph for mule deer, specific for mule deer. And then we also used previous summer precip, standardized across the study areas. So on the x-axis, what we're looking at is the results from a multivariate analysis. But in plain terms, you can think of this as body size. Okay, if you're tall and skinny, if you wanted to relate it to humans, you would be above the lines of both of those. If you're short and robust, you would be below the line. In wildlife populations, that's usually a good thing. You want to have some body fat on you. You're going to be more likely to survive and more likely to produce offspring. So we use that weight versus body size index to come up with our body condition index. So this is the result from the modeling, and I'm not going to kind of get in the weeds, but we basically use the top model from the modeling process. That AIC score is a way to rank the different models for the best fit. So the best one that came up was one that included variables for sex, age, a sex by season interaction, winter severity, body condition index, and then for migration distance, we actually model with a quadratic function, which I have a little better graph. Now I realize that these are a standardized beta coefficient is not intuitive, but the best way to interpret them is if it's a negative number, it's a negative effect. If it's a positive number, it's a positive effect. So I'm going to skip the first 3 bars and go right to winter severity. It's a negative effect. So that makes obvious intuitive sense. The more severe the winter, the more negative effect it's going to have on survival. If you jump to the next one, body mass, which is actually body condition, positive effect. So the more body fat you have, the more likely you are to survive. Not surprising, that was our original hypothesis. And then the migration distance is a little bit more complex when you do it as a quadratic. So I'm going to jump back to the first 3 bars, this male winter, male summer, male autumn. So in this case, I included hunting mortality as a source. And the reason that male autumn is so much lower is because we had about 12%, if you remember back to that pie chart, harvest. So that makes sense, but it also shows that there's mortality outside of just hunting, even during the autumn. So we have bucks getting killed by predation or hit by cars on the road, things like that. But I think the real interesting part is that when you look at outside the hunting season, what this is showing is that compared to females, male survival is also lower during the winter and also lower during the summer. And so even though in our population models we account for harvest, we're still seeing higher lower survival for males outside of the hunting season. That's something that hasn't been well documented in the literature, and I do think it has direct implications for our quota setting process. It lends evidence that it does no good to stockpile bucks. The more bucks you stockpile, the more opportunity there are for them to die for natural events such as predation or malnutrition and things like that. So this is an easier way to look at the effects, that quadratic relationship that I was talking about for displacement, for migration. So what this is showing you is that for residents, if you'll remember back to those displacement curves, they don't move very far. They have lower survival. If you look there between 0 and 30 on the x-axis, their survival is lower. As you increase in distance, migration distance, your probability of survival increases. But it's a threshold effect. Up to a certain point, those long distance migrators, they're actually incurring a greater cost in terms of survivorship. Now the error bars do get wide. When you get past 120 kilometers, that means you have less and less confidence in that. But the relationship, we're confident that the relationship it's a true relationship. There's just more variability as you get out. Fewer migrants that do the 120 plus kilometer migration, so there's fewer mortality events to document. Here's our fawn survival estimates going back 2011. This is just for the Ruby Mountains. One thing that just stands out right away is that 2013. We started out in January, that's when we put the collars on, so they started out at 100%, but we're down to 50% by June. Now, I should point out that when I say fawns, I'm talking about 6-month-old fawns. We caught them in January, so they're not newborn fawns, but this is how we quantify overwinter fawn survival, similar to what we do on our models for our population estimates. Although you may note that 2013 was actually, in terms of winter severity, in the Rubies we had an average snowpack, but it wasn't a severe winter by most people's standards. However, followed by 3 years of drought. I think that's the key. This is 2013. It was the last year we did the fawn collaring study, and we saw our most significant declines in fawn mortality. Another thing to note, and I'm going to have to bring up Director Wasley on this one too, but I was in my office the other day, and he asked me, Cody, did you approve this notion to move back our spring survey flights by a week in the western region? I said, well, yeah, I did. I wasn't real happy about it, but I was just trying to be a team player. And he said, well, don't you have data showing that we actually have significant mortality after the time we typically survey? And I said, well, yeah. He said, well, isn't that going in the opposite direction that we should be going? I said, yeah, you're right, Tony. And he walked out and he said, well, I'm gonna do something about that. So the moral of the story is it's good to have your director's backing, but also the moral is he's always watching over your shoulder. If you just compare that with the other study areas, we have the Simpson Parks and the Carson Range, similar trends for 2013. Now, interestingly, overall, Carson fawns had the highest survival when you look at it over a 3-year average. But if you look at 2013, that red line, we saw that same trend. We started out with 100, we're down to 50% by June. Similar trends with the survey period. It indicates that we do not want to push our surveys back into February. That's one thing. And also that we may be underestimating slightly overwinter survival. Our current methods. The photos below just show some different carcasses. That center photo has actually been in the Carson River fishing a fawn out from between those rocks. It took us forever to find out what happened to that thing, but we finally found it wedged under those big boulders. I think it tried to cross the river in the spring when there was ice, and it got stuck in there, and then it eventually washed down into that big crack. So when we looked at differences between males and females in fawns, we see a striking difference. The blue triangles are males, the gray are females. This pattern was consistent throughout all the study areas. And we see the trend is the same. Male survival is lower. We also see this regional trend where we had the lowest survival overall in the Ruby Mountains, highest survival in the Carson, and then the Simpson Parks were sort of central. Now, if you just, we didn't test this explicitly, but if you just plot these in the order of population density, there's a trend there. Higher population density, lower fawn survival. We look at both when we combine the effects of sex and body condition. We see some pretty significant trends here. On the left-hand side, we have adult survival. On the right-hand side, we have juvenile survival. That body mass index is what I described earlier. Basically, the more positive you are, the better body condition, the more body fat you have. The more negative the number, the poorer the condition. And so we see several things here. We see that male-female difference in adults, and we also see it in juveniles. But interestingly, as deer become in better condition, we see that, oops, I'm sorry, I can't go back. We see the difference go away. So the males and female survival actually becomes similar when they're in better body condition. And I also think that this lends credit to keeping populations below their carrying capacity. That's a standard tenet of wildlife management, and we have the data to show it. Now, we didn't set out purely to identify cause-specific mortality, but this I get often asked this question, so I have this figure that shows this is the sources of mortality when we combine all three study areas, and this is all adults and juveniles combined. So the first thing that stands out is that 48% unknown. It's extremely difficult to get out on these animals in a timely manner. As most people know, or many people know, if you're out there during the winter and a fawn hits the ground, if you're not out there within a day, it's almost indistinguishable other than a few bones. Our GPS collars we did a little better on because it actually sends you a mortality signal in the middle of the night. So if you check the email the next day, you can be out there the same day. But we did identify these different sources. 30% predation. Now I should note that this is the percentage of the total mortalities that we picked up. So that 30% is not 30% of the population, it's 30% of the mortalities that we investigated. We did a pretty good job. You can see the total there. We've investigated 332 sites, and those are the raw numbers there in the table, 100 more predation events, 6 capture related. Now when I say capture, this is actually more of a censoring thing. So we did have a few mortalities from the helicopter capture. That's actually less than 1%. But if an animal died within 1 week of being captured, we considered that a capture-related event. And that's because deer are known to, they can at times get capture myopathy. When being chased by a helicopter, they build up lactic acid, and sometimes they just are unable to succumb or overcome that, or they might be killed by a predator, but we consider that to be related to the capture and not a natural event. But still pretty good, pretty low, 3%. Miscellaneous injuries, things like getting tangled up in a fence. Malnourished, now there's probably a significant more in that unknown category that are malnourished, but these are carcasses that we investigated. There was no obvious predation. They were just laying there, sometimes even unscavenged. And we investigated the body condition and the femur, things like that, and determined them to be malnourished. So another interesting thing here on the bottom is this harvest. We had about 11% of our deer collars harvested, mostly bucks. We did have 1 or 2 does legally harvested. Illegal harvest, at least that we can tell. We've only had 4. Actually, I was made aware we may have 1 more now, but it's still going to be under 2% illegal harvest rate. And then roadkill, 4%. That's actually mostly driven by the Carson range, which was, when you look at it on a study-wide, it's like 11%. Very, very little road mortality in the Rubies, 0 road mortality in the Simpson Parks, which makes kind of sense if you know of the traffic levels in those areas. So here's a typical investigation site. In this case, this was a predator kill, a mountain lion. The lion did a good job of skinning the head for us so we could determine the age and other factors. Dismembered the ear. That's a typical predation, mountain lion predation event. But what I wanted to show is that on the lower part of the picture there, that's the femur that we've cracked open. And we analyzed the marrow to look at, we use that as an index of body condition. So animals typically catabolize their body fat during the winter. And when they use up all their body fat, they go to internal organ fat, like the heart and the kidneys. And then the last thing to go is their marrow. They actually catabolize fat in their bones. So in this case, white and waxy, this animal is in really healthy condition. So this animal is perfectly healthy, at least in terms of nutritional stress. However, it did have the unfortunate demise of this ultimate death. There's just a close view of the femur marrow fat. You can see some coloration change. Now, if that animal was really using up its femur marrow fat, that would turn to pink and then red and gelatinous. So here's a different scenario. This is what we determined as a coyote kill, predation event. And here's the femur. You see a lot different. That's red and gelatinous. That typically indicates the animal was severely nutritionally stressed. So it was actually probably malnourished when it was walking around. The ultimate demise was eaten by a coyote, but you can see it was in really poor condition. It was essentially walking dead. So now just to touch up on some of the mining related projects. So I mentioned the 3 project study areas, Bald Mountain. You can see it's depicted here on the right-hand side. That's that same movement pattern. We used a fancy model to model the movements called the Brownian Bridge movement model, but it's essentially like a home range stretched over a large scale. The hatched color there is the Bald Mountain mine. It's right center in the middle of the Ruby Mountain deer migration corridor. So we collaborated on this project with Barrick, Department of Wildlife, and University of Nevada, Reno. Barrick provided funding for the collars. This is Bald Mountain Mine. The point of the study was to look at migration corridor impediments by large-scale gold mine. And the reason that we're concerned is because Barrick has a proposal in to expand by about 30%. So far, we've collared 42 deer. We've actually collared more than that. As of 2013, it was 42. In the study area, the collar is designed to take a point every hour to get fine-scale movements. But another part of the collaring, you don't just get a point, you actually get an activity signal. So every time the deer moves, there's a tip switch inside the collar. If it's functioning properly, it gives you a count of every time it tipped its head up. So if an animal's walking, you can imagine that it's going to, kind of like these Fitbit transmitters that we're wearing now, it logs the number of tips as you're walking along, or if you're foraging. And actually the BLM asked us to provide us this data because they were considering temporal restrictions, timing restrictions on mining activity. So what you see in the graph is time of day and frequency on the y-axis. So that's the number of tips. So the more a deer moves, is more active, the more tips you're going to count. And you can see 2 peaks right there. It's no surprise to any sportsman or avid wildlife watcher, the peaks of the activity are from 5 in the morning till 8 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon till 6 in the afternoon. Now that's not to say the deer don't move around the rest of the time of the day. You can see they're still counting movements, even at midday and even at 12 o'clock at night, but the majority of the movements are during those hours. And we provided that to BLM to hopefully help their decision-making process with regards to mining. So this is some work that UNR did in collaboration with NDOW, and this is Marcus Bloom's master's research. On the left-hand side, this is the results of another statistical model, and I'll put it into layman's terms. I apologize for the font being small, but I have some graphics. So these are beta coefficients. The dots represent slopes of lines for different habitat types. So the first one we have is high disturbance areas. These would be things like pits, rock disposal areas, waste dump, rock sites, things like that. High disturbance areas within the mine. The green is medium disturbance, things like ancillary facilities, haul roads, and ponds, things like ponds. Low disturbances within the mine complex, there can be exploration sites, things that have been rehabbed, but they're still disturbed, so we considered that low disturbance. And what the trend you see, the interpretation of these lines is that the more negative it is, indicates avoidance of that habitat type. And so we see this strong positive correlation between high disturbance and low disturbance. So deer can tolerate low disturbance, but they still avoid it if they can. If you look to the right, they preferred shrubland, which is obvious in the winter for mule deer. They avoided high disturbance areas within the mine. On the right-hand side, Marcus also looked at efficiency of movement. He basically calculated how efficient deer were at getting through the mine. So he looked at inside and outside, and he found that deer were less efficient going through the mine if you looked at it in a straight north-south directionality. He also found the movement rate change between inside and outside the mine. So we also did some contract work with consultant West Inc., leading industry expert on mule deer migration ecology, published papers in top journals on the subject of mule deer migration and disturbance. He provided us with this analysis. You see on the right-hand side, it's a model. I mentioned it earlier. We call it the Brownian Bridge movement model, but it's essentially you take a bunch of radio-collared deer and you stack up their points and you count the number of times that they overlap, and that model gives you an idea of the population level migratory route. And so that red color, that you could think of that as a vein. That's the main vein of the Ruby Mountain deer herd. Migrates south, it leaves the south end of the Rubies, goes right through the smack Bald Mountain proper, and then they continue on. Some animals continue on to Buck Mountain and even farther south to Antelope Summit. So this is what we're worried about. This is the existing surface disturbance on Bald Mountain Mine right now. You can see the red color is the population, the high use population route. We do have a sort of a bifurcation right there in the middle of the mine. But what we're really worried about is the proposed expansion. If you can, I apologize for the font being small, but the lower right, left-hand side of that mining complex is called the Redbird RDA and also the Redbird Pit. Those are smack in the middle of that migratory corridor. And so we've been working with BLM and Barrick to try to come up with some innovative design features for mule deer. However, it's the current status is it's in draft status for the EIS and ready for public comment period here in the next few months. So we did a similar thing for the Pequot Mountains, Brownian Bridge movement model. Marcus also did this for us. And the reason we're concerned about the Pequots is because there's a proposed new mine in Long Canyon. Now this scenario is slightly less dire for mule deer, fortunately. The proposed mine site, the pit, and the processing facilities, at least currently, are not smack in the middle of the corridor. The little depiction on the right, the black is the outline of the mine boundary. However, the actual facilities, the mine and the processing, are denoted there in the black. Now, but keep in mind that this data was collected over 2012 and 2013, which were very mild years. And the primary route was to use Long Canyon on the Pequot Mountains there. We are concerned that in heavy snow years, the deer might not be able to utilize those higher elevations in Long Canyon. They'll be forced to go use that more southern east route. So you can see there in the yellow, we do have deer that use the lower elevation slopes there. We're also looking at overpass potential proposal by DOT at Pequot Summit. So this is just showing some of the proposed location sites. 2 overpasses and an underpass. The entire project cost is estimated at $13 million. DOT is balking at that for obvious reasons. So the current negotiations, our current proposal is to sort of build it in a phased process. So we might consider building 1 overpass, putting the fencing in, and then continuing on the project through several years. Here's the proposed site for Pequot Summit where the overpass would be built. This is the existing structure that was just completed at Silver Zone. So the reason the cost on these are so high is they have to go across 2 lanes, 4-lane traffic, interstate. There's a lot of regulations in terms of engineering design that have to be robust. So the Pequot Summit would look something similar to this. And I think the one overpass cost on that is estimated about $2 to $3 million, not including, that does include fencing, but not the entire Pequot fencing, the slide I showed earlier. So that'd be 4 miles on each side of the summit. When we overlaid Marcus's Brownian Bridge movement model on the proposed site, it actually looks pretty well. These sites will definitely benefit mule deer. If any of you have followed or seen any of the results that we've done on Highway 93 at HD Summit and 10 Mile, hugely successful. I don't have time to go into them today, but we expect the same results on I-80 on Pequot Summit if we can get these projects through. And one of the hurdles that we're facing right now is funding. As I mentioned, it's a huge undertaking, and DOT is going to go after highway safety funds, but they're also going to be looking to outside funds for things like building fences and other things like that. And just finally on this mining, we just got this data back. We've also been monitoring deer in Area 6. This is a Carlin Trend area. You can't see it, but they're right there in the 068, the Carlin Trend anticline, where most of the mining activity is a nexus for mule deer. It's summer on the Independence and the Bull Run Mountains, and winter south along I-80 there. Now the interesting note I think on here is when we overlaid the Pequot model with the Carlin Trend deer, we see they share summer range. They're on the Ichabods, and then we see this divergent strategy of where to migrate. Some go to the Pequots and some go south along the South Independence and the Sheep Creek Range. So we just finished collecting those collars. We really haven't done any robust analysis at this point, but we'll be looking to do that in the future. So just to wrap things up, some of our conclusions: we saw highly variable migration strategies across Nevada, dependent on weather and climatic variables, also highly dependent on the study area. Our fawn survival was highly variable, but it was influenced by the severity of winter, body condition, better body condition individuals had higher survival, and also dependent on their migratory strategy. We did see lower survival for both juveniles and males. There was about a 10% difference for adult bucks after accounting for hunting mortality. So we think the mechanism for that would be the costs incurred during breeding. They lose up to 20% of their body weight during the rut. They also get injured fighting, and then you throw in dispersal, especially for yearling and younger bucks in there, and we think that might be contributing to this lower survival. And then finally, the mining projects continue to pose challenges for mule deer, especially maintaining healthy and viable migration corridors. And we think it's important to be proactive. We are definitely being proactive in the NEPA processes and other coordination with federal land management agencies. So that, I'd just like to acknowledge some of the field help and also the funding sources, the Wildlife Heritage Trust account. We did get funding from University of Nevada, Ag Experiment Station, and the College of Ag and Biotechnology and Natural Resources. And also we did receive funding from Nevada Bighorn Unlimited. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions if there's time, or you can feel free to find me later.
Any questions? All right, seeing none. Thank you. Both presentations were fantastic and a lot of information. Appreciate that. Commissioner Bliss, did you have something?
I was just going to say that I had a few questions, but you answered them all during the deal, and so I appreciate your time and effort and what we're all able to learn from these type of studies. They're very valuable, and I think they'll be great for the future of mule deer in Nevada. So, thank you.
Okay, anybody else have anything? All right, let's take a 10-minute break. Let's come back. Well, let's come back at 3:20.